November 20th, 1945. In a shattered Germany, inside a courtroom in the city of Nuremberg, history itself took the witness stand. The war was over. Adolf Hitler was dead. Berlin lay in ruins. But the question lingered: how do you judge a regime responsible for unimaginable crimes? Before an international tribunal, leading Nazis, including Hermann Göring, sat behind glass, headphones pressed to their ears, as translators pioneered a new system of simultaneous interpretation. For the first time, crimes against humanity entered the legal vocabulary of the world. Outside the courtroom, post-war Germany struggled to survive. Cities were rubble. Millions were displaced. Hunger and uncertainty shaped daily life as Allied powers divided the country into occupation zones, planting the early seeds of the Cold War. The Nuremberg trials were not just about punishment. They were about precedent, about drawing a line between obedience and responsibility. Tonight, we explore how justice was pursued and how a broken nation began rebuilding from the ashes. In the spring of 1945, Europe was a graveyard. Cities that had stood for centuries lay in skeletal ruin, their streets choked with rubble and the stench of death. From Stalingrad to London, from Warsaw to Dresden, the Second World War had consumed more than 60 million lives: soldiers, civilians, children, entire communities erased from the earth. Warsaw had lost roughly 85% of its buildings after the Nazi forces systematically demolished the city block by block following the 1944 uprising. Berlin, once the glittering capital of a continent-spanning empire, was reduced to what journalists described as a moonscape of hollowed facades and mountains of broken stone. In Hamburg, the firestorms of Operation Gomorrah in 1943 had created winds so powerful they uprooted trees and temperatures so intense that asphalt melted, killing over 35,000 civilians in a single week. And as Allied forces pushed deeper into the heart of the Third Reich, the full horror of what had been hidden behind barbed wire and watchtowers was revealed to the world. On April 4, 1945, elements of the American 4th Armored Division stumbled upon the Ohrdruf concentration camp in Thuringia, the first camp liberated by United States forces on German soil. General Dwight D. Eisenhower visited the camp days later and was so profoundly shaken that he ordered every American soldier in the area who was not on the front line to tour the grounds. "We are told that the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for," Eisenhower wrote to General George Marshall. "Now, at least, he will know what he is fighting against." He also insisted that journalists and members of Congress be brought in to document the atrocities, foreseeing with remarkable prescience that there would one day be those who tried to deny it ever happened. The concentration camps at Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and Treblinka unveiled a machinery of death so systematic, so industrialized, that it defied comprehension. When British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, they found over 13,000 unburied corpses and approximately 60,000 starving prisoners ravaged by typhus. The British Broadcasting Corporation's Richard Dimbleby, one of the first reporters on the scene, broke down during his broadcast, later recalling that the British Broadcasting Corporation initially refused to air his report because they thought he was exaggerating. The Holocaust, the deliberate murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime, including Roma, disabled individuals, political dissidents, homosexuals, and Soviet prisoners of war, was no longer rumor or propaganda. It was undeniable fact, captured in film, in photographs, in the hollowed eyes of survivors who barely clung to life. The Third Reich, which its architects had boasted would endure 1,000 years, had collapsed in just 12. Its founder, Adolf Hitler, died by his own hand on April 30, 1945. In a bunker beneath the smouldering ruins of Berlin, having married his longtime companion Eva Braun just 36 hours earlier in a grim ceremony illuminated by candlelight, while Soviet shells shook the walls above them. He was too cowardly in the end to face the world he had destroyed. His propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, followed him into death the next day, but not before he and his wife Magda poisoned their 6 young children with cyanide, an act that remains one of the war's most haunting final atrocities. 8 days later, on May 7, 1945, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Eisenhower's headquarters in a modest red schoolhouse in Reims, France. A second signing ceremony took place the following day in Berlin at Soviet insistence, and May 8th was declared Victory in Europe, Day VE Day. In London, crowds thronged the mall outside Buckingham Palace, and Winston Churchill addressed the nation from the balcony of the Ministry of Health, declaring, "This is your victory." In New York, 2 million people packed Times Square. In Moscow, a 1,000-gun salute thundered over the Kremlin. But behind the joy, an enormous and unprecedented question loomed over the victorious powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France. What do you do with evil after it has ruled an entire continent? How do you hold individuals accountable for crimes so vast they seem beyond the reach of any courtroom? As the British philosopher and historian R.G. Tanda Collingwood had once observed, civilization rests on the fragile belief that certain things are simply not done, and the Nazis had shattered that belief completely. For the first time in history, leaders of a defeated regime would be tried not just for waging war, but for crimes against humanity itself. The path to that courtroom was anything but straightforward. In the months following Germany's surrender, the Allied leaders debated fiercely over what justice should look like. The question had been simmering since at least 1943, when Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met at the Tehran Conference, and the Soviet leader reportedly raised a glass to toast the execution of 50,000 German officers. Roosevelt, perhaps attempting humor, is said to have suggested a compromise of 49,000, prompting an outraged Churchill to storm out of the room before Stalin assured him it had been a joke, though historians have debated whether Stalin was joking at all. Churchill at times entertained the idea of summary executions for top Nazi leaders, arguing that their guilt was self-evident and no trial was necessary. Henry Morgenthau Jr., the United States Secretary of the Treasury, proposed what became known as the Morgenthau Plan, which would have stripped Germany of all industry and reduced it to an agrarian state, a proposal that Roosevelt briefly supported before cooler heads prevailed. But it was the American legal position, championed most forcefully by Secretary of War Henry Stimson and later by Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, that ultimately shaped the outcome. Stimson argued passionately that executions without trial would make the Allies no better than the regime they had defeated. The United States insisted that the world needed a trial not for the sake of the defendants, but for the sake of civilization. There had to be a legal record, an undeniable archive of evidence, so that no future generation could deny what had happened or claim it was exaggerated. The rule of law, the Americans insisted, had to triumph even in the face of unimaginable lawlessness. As Jackson himself would later say, to pass these defendants a poisoned chalice is to put it to our own lips as well. This conviction led to the signing of the London Charter on August 8, 1945, negotiated over 6 intense weeks by representatives of the 4 Allied powers in London's Church House. The Charter was a revolutionary document, drafted in an atmosphere of urgency and sharp legal disagreement. The Soviet delegation, accustomed to a legal system in which the state's interests superseded individual rights, clashed repeatedly with the American and British lawyers who insisted on procedural safeguards for the defendants. It defined 4 categories of charges under which the Nazi leadership would be prosecuted. Conspiracy to commit crimes against peace. Crimes against peace, meaning the planning and waging of aggressive war in violation of international treaties, such as the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. War crimes, violations of the laws and customs of war, including the mistreatment and murder of prisoners of war and civilian populations, and most groundbreaking of all crimes against humanity. This final charge was entirely new to international law. It encompassed murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed against civilian populations, whether or not such acts violated the domestic law of the country where they were committed. For the first time, the international community declared that a government's treatment of its own citizens was not merely an internal matter, but a concern of all humanity. The Charter also enshrined a principle that would reshape international law forever. Individuals, not just states, could be held criminally responsible for their actions, even if those actions were carried out under the orders of a sovereign government. Article 8 of the Charter was explicit the fact that a defendant acted pursuant to the order of a superior would not free him from responsibility, though it could be considered in mitigation of punishment. The city chosen for this historic reckoning was Nuremberg, and the choice was laden with symbolism. Nuremberg had been the spiritual heart of the Nazi movement. It was there, every September from 1933 onward, that the regime held its massive annual rallies at the sprawling Reichsparteitagsgelände, a complex of parade grounds, arenas, and monumental structures designed by Albert Speer to project an image of invincible power. The 1934 rally was immortalized in Leni Riefenstahl's propaganda film Triumph of the Will, which depicted hundreds of thousands of uniformed party members marching in lockstep before their Führer, a spectacle designed to awe and intimidate in equal measure. It was there, in 1935, at the conclusion of the annual rally, that the infamous Nuremberg laws had been unanimously passed by a specially convened session of the Reichstag. These laws, the Reich Citizenship Law and the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, stripped Jewish citizens of their German citizenship, prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews, and set in motion the legal marginalization that would culminate in genocide. Now, the same city where racial hatred had been codified into law would host the trial of those who wrote it. There were practical reasons as well. The Palace of Justice, a massive neo-Renaissance building on Further Strasse, was one of the few large structures in Germany still largely intact, thanks in part to the American forces having specifically targeted it for preservation during the final advance. Its courtroom 600, though spacious, had to be significantly remodeled to accommodate the proceedings. Walls were knocked down, a visitors' gallery was added, and simultaneous translation equipment was installed, a technological innovation that allowed proceedings to be conducted in 4 languages: English, French, Russian, and German, using a system developed by International Business Machines. The building also had a prison attached directly to it by a covered walkway, making it an ideal venue for a proceeding of this extraordinary scale and security requirement. 24 major war criminals were indicted, though only 21 ultimately stood trial. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary who had wielded enormous power in the final years of the Reich, was tried in absentia, his fate unknown at the time. Though his remains were discovered during construction work in Berlin in 1972 and confirmed through deoxyribonucleic acid analysis in 1998. Robert Ley, the head of the German Labour Front, who had overseen the exploitation of millions of workers, committed suicide in his cell on October 25, 1945, hanging himself with a towel before the trial began, leaving behind a rambling note in which he wrote, "We have forsaken God, and therefore we were forsaken by God." The industrialist Gustav Krupp, whose factories had profited enormously from slave labor, was deemed too ill and too senile to face the court, a decision that frustrated prosecutors who had hoped to make an example of the complicity of German industry. Among those who did sit in the dock were some of the most powerful men in the Third Reich. Hermann Göring, the flamboyant, morphine-addicted commander of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor, was the highest-ranking defendant and clearly intended to dominate the proceedings with his intelligence and force of personality. During his imprisonment, the American psychologist Gustav Gilbert conducted extensive interviews with the defendants and administered intelligence quotient tests. Göring scored 138, among the highest of the group. Gilbert's diary, later published as Nuremberg Diary, provides an invaluable and often chilling record of the defendants' private conversations. It was during one such exchange that Goering made his infamous observation about the mechanics of power. Naturally, the common people don't want war. But, after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along. Rudolf Hess, once Hitler's loyal deputy Führer, who had made a bizarre solo flight to Scotland in 1941 in an apparent attempt to negotiate peace, sat in apparent confusion. His mental state, a matter of ongoing debate among both contemporaries and historians. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister who had signed the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union in 1939 and helped orchestrate the diplomatic maneuvers that preceded the war, appeared shaken and diminished, a far cry from the arrogant envoy who had once kept King George VI waiting. Albert Speer, the brilliant architect turned Minister of Armaments who had exploited millions of slave laborers to keep Germany's war machine functioning, adopted a unique strategy. He was the only defendant to accept a degree of moral responsibility, a calculated gambit that likely saved his life and earned him the label "the good Nazi" in some post-war accounts. Though later scholarship, particularly the work of historian Gitta Sereni, revealed that Speer almost certainly knew far more about the Holocaust than he ever admitted. Others included Wilhelm Keitel, the pliable chief of the Armed Forces High Command, who had signed numerous criminal orders and whom fellow officers privately mocked as Lackitel, a pun on the German word for lackey, and Alfred Jodl, the operations chief who had authorized the commando order directing that captured Allied commandos be executed without trial. Julius Streicher, the virulently anti-Semitic publisher of the notorious weekly newspaper Der Stürmer, whose crude caricatures and incendiary rhetoric had helped poison German culture against Jews for over 2 decades, was included not because he had held military or administrative power, but because his propaganda had helped lay the psychological groundwork for genocide. Beyond the individuals, the tribunal also declared entire Nazi organizations criminal, including the Schutzstaffel, the Geheime Staatspolizei, and the Sicherheitsdienst, the regime's security and intelligence apparatus, a ruling that meant mere membership in these organizations could serve as the basis for future prosecution of lower-ranking members. The prosecution's case was overwhelming, and it relied on an unusual and ultimately brilliant strategy. Rather than building the case primarily on witness testimony, which could be challenged, contradicted, or emotionally dismissed, the prosecution leaned heavily on the Nazis' own meticulous records. The regime, in its bureaucratic thoroughness and its perverse pride in efficiency, had documented its own crimes with astonishing precision. Meeting minutes from the Wannsee Conference of January 20th, 1942, where senior Nazi officials had gathered in a lakeside villa outside Berlin over cognac and a working lunch to calmly coordinate the logistics of the final solution to the Jewish question. Signed orders from Keitel authorizing the Nacht- und Nebel decree, under which political opponents in occupied territories were made to vanish without a trace into the night and fog. Detailed Einsatzgruppen operational reports, such as the infamous Jäger report compiled by SS Standartenführer Karl Jäger, which listed with chilling precision the date, location, and exact number of men, women, and children murdered in Lithuania, a document that read like a bookkeeper's ledger of death. Administrative records from the concentration and extermination camps, and correspondence about the slave labor system that had worked millions to death in the service of the German war machine. The prosecution introduced over 4,000 documents into evidence, creating a paper trail of genocide that the defendants could not plausibly deny. Film footage shot by Allied forces upon liberating the camps was shown in the courtroom on November 29, 1945, and the effect was devastating. The lights were dimmed, and for over an hour the courtroom watched in silence as images of mass graves, emaciated survivors, and piles of human remains flickered across the screen. Hardened soldiers, seasoned journalists, and even some of the defendants themselves were visibly shaken. Gilbert noted that several defendants averted their eyes, and that Hjalmar Schacht turned his back on the screen entirely, while Hans Frank, the former Governor-General of occupied Poland, was seen nervously swallowing. Survivor testimony added human voices to the statistical horror. Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier, a French resistance member who had survived Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, testified in January 1946, describing the selections at the camp ramp, the screams from the gas chambers, and the medical experiments performed on prisoners, delivering her account with a composure that made it all the more shattering. Robert H. Jackson, the chief United States prosecutor, who had been personally appointed by President Harry Truman, opened the trial on November 21, 1945, with an address that has echoed through the decades. Speaking for over 4 hours in a measured, deliberate tone, he told the tribunal, "The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating, that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated." He spoke of the responsibility the tribunal bore, and warned that civilization itself was asking whether law was so laggard as to be utterly helpless in the face of crimes of this magnitude. His words framed the trial not as an act of vengeance but as a test of whether justice could be applied even to the most powerful. The British prosecution team, led by Sir Hartley Shawcross, the Attorney General, complemented Jackson's moral framework with detailed legal argumentation, while the French and Soviet prosecution teams focused respectively on crimes committed in Western and Eastern Europe. The defense, for its part, employed several strategies, most of which would ultimately be rejected by the tribunal. The most common refrain was the claim of superior orders. Befehl ist Befehl. The defendants insisted, an order is an order, arguing that obedience to authority was a soldier's sacred duty, and that refusal would have meant their own imprisonment or death. Otto Ohlendorf, the commander of Einsatzgruppe D, which had murdered over 90,000 people, testified with unsettling calm that he had merely carried out the orders of his superiors, and that he saw no moral distinction between his actions and the Allied bombing of German cities. Others claimed ignorance, asserting that they had no knowledge of the genocide, even as documentary evidence placed them at the very center of decision-making. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS officer to stand trial, repeatedly denied any involvement with the concentration camps, only to have his own signed orders for prisoner executions presented to the court. Many pointed the finger at Hitler himself, arguing that all true authority and criminal intent had resided with the Führer, who was conveniently no longer alive to contradict them, a defense that Telford Taylor, who served as Jackson's assistant and later led the subsequent Nuremberg military tribunals, acidly described as the empty chair defense. Some defense attorneys, most notably Hermann Jaris in his closing arguments, took a bolder approach, arguing that the Allies themselves had committed acts that could be considered war crimes. The firebombing of Dresden, which had killed an estimated 25,000 civilians in February 1945, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Soviet Union's own record of mass deportations, forced labor, and territorial aggression. This tu quoque argument, "you did it too," while not without a certain uncomfortable logic, did not sway the tribunal. The court firmly rejected the defense of superior orders as an absolute shield, establishing the principle that individuals have a moral and legal obligation to refuse manifestly criminal commands. The concept of command responsibility, that leaders bear criminal liability for the actions of those under their authority, was cemented into international law, a principle that would reverberate far beyond Nuremberg. On October 1, 1946, after 218 days of proceedings, 240 witnesses, and over 300,000 sworn affidavits, the verdicts were delivered over the course of 2 days. The judges Francis Biddle of the United States, Sir Geoffrey Lawrence of the United Kingdom, who served as president of the tribunal, Henri Donadieu de Vabre of France, and Iona Nikitchenko of the Soviet Union read the judgments in a courtroom packed with journalists, military officials, and legal observers from around the world. 12 defendants were sentenced to death by hanging, including Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Jodl, Streicher, Sokol, Rosenberg, Frank, Frick, Seyss-Inquart, and the absent Bormann. 3 received sentences of life imprisonment: Rudolf Hess, Walther Funk, the economics minister who had helped launder gold taken from Holocaust victims, and Erich Raeder, the former naval commander-in-chief. 4 received prison terms ranging from 10 to 20 years, among them Albert Speer, who received 20 years and served every day of his sentence in Spandau prison, and Karl Dönitz, Hitler's appointed successor and commander of the U-boat fleet, who received 10 years. 3 defendants, Hjalmar Schacht, the financier who had helped fund Hitler's rise to power but had later fallen out of favor, Franz von Papen, the former chancellor who had helped maneuver Hitler into the chancellorship in 1933, and Hans Fritze, a senior official in the propaganda ministry, were acquitted, a decision that provoked outrage among many observers, but that underscored the tribunal's commitment to judicial fairness rather than a predetermined outcome. The Soviet judge, Nikitchenko, filed a formal dissent, arguing that Hess should have been sentenced to death and that the 3 acquittals were unjustified. Hermann Göring, ever defiant to the last, cheated the hangman by swallowing a cyanide capsule on the night of October 15th, just hours before his scheduled execution. How he obtained the poison in his closely guarded cell has never been definitively established, though theories range from a sympathetic American guard to the capsule having been hidden in a container of pomade. The remaining 10 condemned men were hanged in the early hours of October 16, 1946, in the gymnasium of the Nuremberg prison by Master Sergeant John C. Woods, an American military executioner whose competence was later questioned. Several of the hangings were reportedly botched, with some of the condemned taking as long as 20 minutes to die from strangulation rather than the near instantaneous death that a properly executed drop should have caused. Ribbentrop was the first to mount the scaffold. His final words were, "God protect Germany. My last wish is that Germany discover her unity and that an understanding be reached between East and West." Streicher, unrepentant to the end, shouted, "Heil Hitler!" and Purim Fest 1946, a bitter reference to the Jewish holiday celebrating deliverance from persecution before the trapdoor opened. Their bodies, along with Göring's corpse, were photographed, loaded onto trucks, driven to a crematorium in Munich, and their ashes scattered in the Isar River to prevent any future shrine from being erected. The Nuremberg trials were not without their critics, and intellectual honesty demands that these criticisms be acknowledged, even as one recognizes the trial's profound historical significance. The charge of victor's justice was raised immediately and has never fully dissipated. The Allies sat in judgment, but no Allied commander faced prosecution for the firebombing of civilian populations, the use of atomic weapons on Japanese cities, or for the Soviet Union's extensive catalogue of wartime atrocities. The legal charge of retroactive law, the principle known as ex post facto, which holds that individuals should not be punished for acts that were not criminal at the time they were committed, was particularly pointed. The defendants were being tried under laws that had not formally existed when their crimes were committed, and some of the most distinguished legal minds of the era, including the American Senator Robert A. Taft, objected on these grounds. Taft, a conservative Republican and the son of a former president, gave a speech in October 1946 in which he called the trials a blot on American constitutional history, an act of political courage that likely cost him the 1948 Republican presidential nomination, but that earned him a profile in John F. Kennedy's Profiles in Courage. The presence of Soviet judges on the tribunal was especially troubling, given that the Soviet Union had itself committed the Katyn massacre in 1940. The mass execution of over 22,000 Polish military officers, police, and intellectuals in the Katyn forest and other sites carried out on Stalin's direct orders. The Soviets had attempted to include the Katyn massacre as a charge against the Germans during the trial, but the prosecution ultimately dropped this line of argument when it became clear that the evidence pointed unmistakably towards Soviet guilt, a truth the Soviet government would not officially acknowledge until 1990. Selective prosecution was another concern. Many industrialists, scientists, and bureaucrats who had enabled the Nazi machine escaped accountability entirely. Operation Paperclip, a secret American program, recruited over 1,600 German scientists and engineers, including Wernher von Braun, who had used slave labor from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp to build the V-2 rockets and brought them to the United States, where they were given new identities and put to work on the American space and missile programs. Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's intelligence chief on the Eastern Front, was recruited by the Central Intelligence Agency to establish a spy network against the Soviets, an organization that eventually became the nucleus of West Germany's Federal Intelligence Service. And yet, despite all of these flaws and contradictions, the Nuremberg trials remain foundational. They created the legal architecture upon which all subsequent international criminal law has been built, from the tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda in the 1990s to the Permanent International Criminal Court, established by the Rome Statute in 2002. The principle that individuals, including heads of state, can be held personally accountable for atrocities against civilian populations is a direct inheritance of Nuremberg. As Telford Taylor reflected years later, the Nuremberg trials were not perfect, but they were a giant step for mankind. But the trials were only one piece of a far larger puzzle. Even as the courtroom proceedings unfolded, the victorious Allies were confronting the monumental task of governing and reconstructing a destroyed nation. At the Potsdam Conference in July and August 1945, held in the Sicilienhof Palace just outside Berlin, Truman, Stalin, and Clement Attlee, who had replaced Churchill as British Prime Minister following Labour's surprise election victory, agreed on the broad principles of occupation, demilitarization, denazification, democratization, and decentralization. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, each administered by one of the major Allied powers. The Americans controlled the south, including Bavaria and Hesse, the British the northwest, including the industrial Ruhr Valley and the great port of Hamburg, the French the southwest, including the Rhineland and the Saar, and the Soviets the east, encompassing Saxony, Thuringia, Brandenburg, and Mecklenburg. Berlin, located deep within the Soviet zone, was itself divided into 4 sectors, creating an island of shared control that would become one of the most volatile flashpoints of the coming Cold War. An Allied Control Council was established to coordinate governance across the zones, but cooperation between the Western powers and the Soviet Union quickly deteriorated as ideological differences sharpened into outright hostility. The wartime alliance had always been one of convenience rather than conviction, and with the common enemy defeated, its fractures became unbridgeable. Alongside military governance came the ambitious and deeply complicated process of denazification. The Allies were determined to root out Nazi ideology from every corner of German society, from government offices to schools, from courts to factories. The scale of the problem was staggering. The Nazi Party had counted over 8 million members by the end of the war, and its tentacles had extended into virtually every institution in German life. In the American zone, this effort was pursued with particular zeal under the direction of General Lucius D. Clay. Millions of Germans were required to fill out lengthy questionnaires known as Fragebogen, 131 questions covering every aspect of their political activities, organizational memberships, financial history, and personal associations during the Nazi era. Based on their responses and subsequent investigations, individuals were sorted into 5 categories: major offenders, Hauptschuldig, offenders, belastet, lesser offenders, minder belastet, followers, Mitläufer, and exonerated, entlastet. In theory, the system was thorough and just. In practice, it was overwhelming and often arbitrary. With over 13 million questionnaires processed in the American zone alone and limited resources for investigation, the system bogged down. German tribunals called Spruchkammern were established to handle the cases, but they were understaffed, undertrained, and easily manipulated. Many genuine perpetrators found ways to minimize their involvement or secured testimonials, cynically known as Persilschein or whitewash certificates, after the popular laundry detergent brand Persil from neighbors, colleagues, and even concentration camp survivors who could be persuaded or pressured. The result was a darkly absurd phenomenon in which it sometimes seemed that every German had secretly been a member of the resistance. As the Cold War intensified and the Western Allies increasingly saw West Germany as a crucial bulwark against Soviet expansion, the urgency of denazification faded. By 1951, the process had been largely wound down. Many former Nazis were quietly reintegrated into public life, into the civil service, the judiciary, the intelligence agencies, and the business world. Hans Globke, the legal commentator who had written the official commentary on the Nuremberg racial laws, served as Konrad Adenauer's chief of staff throughout the 1950s. Theodor Oberländer, a former Nazi Party member with connections to wartime atrocities in Ukraine, served as Adenauer's Minister for Refugees. The moral ambiguity of this outcome haunted German society for generations, erupting most explosively in the late 1960s, when the generation that came of age after the war, the so-called 68ers, confronted their parents with furious demands for accountability, a generational reckoning that transformed German political culture. Germany's immediate post-war reality was one of near-total economic collapse. The country had been, in the words of one contemporary observer, bombed back to the Stone Age. The currency, the Reichsmark, was virtually worthless, a phenomenon that echoed the traumatic hyperinflation of 1923 that still haunted the collective German memory. Official markets had all but ceased to function, replaced by a sprawling black market economy where cigarettes, coffee, chocolate, and nylon stockings served as more reliable units of exchange than paper money. American cigarettes were the de facto currency. A carton of Lucky Strikes could buy almost anything. Hunger was widespread. In the brutal winter of 1946 to 1947, known as the Hunger Winter, daily caloric intake in the British zone dropped to as low as 1,000 calories per person, and hundreds of thousands of Germans faced genuine starvation. Cities were filled with rubble, an estimated 400 million cubic meters of it in the western zones alone, and much of the back-breaking work of clearing it was done by the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, who formed human chains to pass bricks from hand to hand, a sight that became one of the iconic images of post-war Germany. Millions of displaced persons, refugees expelled from former German territories in the east, over 12 million ethnic Germans were forcibly relocated from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and other countries in what remains one of the largest forced population transfers in history, and returning soldiers competed for scarce housing and food. The turning point came in 1948 with two pivotal developments. The first was currency reform, introduced on June 20, 1948, when the worthless Reichsmark was replaced overnight by the Deutsche Mark in the western zones. Every German citizen received an initial allocation of 40 new Deutsche Marks, with a second installment of 20 marks following. The effect was almost magical. Goods that had been hoarded for years suddenly appeared in shop windows as if by sorcery, and economic activity began to revive almost immediately. Ludwig Erhard, the portly, cigar-smoking director of economic administration for the combined Western zones, made the audacious decision to simultaneously abolish most wartime price controls and rationing, a move he did not fully clear with the American military authorities. When General Clay reportedly told him, "My advisors tell me what you have done is a terrible mistake," Erhard is said to have replied with a smile, "Don't worry, General. My advisors tell me the same thing." The second pivotal development was the Marshall Plan, the massive American economic aid program officially known as the European Recovery Program, proposed by Secretary of State George C. Marshall in a commencement address at Harvard University on June 5, 1947. West Germany received approximately $1.4 billion in Marshall Plan aid between 1948 and 1952, which provided desperately needed capital for reconstruction and industrial recovery. Under the political leadership of Konrad Adenauer, the 73-year-old former mayor of Cologne, who became the first chancellor of the newly established Federal Republic of Germany in September 1949, and the economic vision of Ludwig Erhard, who championed what he called the soziale Marktwirtschaft, the social market economy, a system blending free market capitalism with social welfare protections and strong labor rights. West Germany embarked on a trajectory of recovery that astonished the world. By the mid-1950s, the country was experiencing what Germans themselves called the Wirtschaftswunder. The economic miracle. Industrial output doubled, unemployment plummeted, and a nation that had been distributing food rations just 7 years earlier was now producing Volkswagens, Siemens appliances, and BASF chemicals for export across the globe. West Germany's gross domestic product grew at an average annual rate of over 8% during the 1950s, a pace of growth that was the envy of Europe. The other Germany followed a very different path. In October 1949, the Soviet occupation zone was formally reconstituted as the German Democratic Republic, or Deutsche Demokratische Republik, with its capital in East Berlin and its first leader, Wilhelm Pieck, serving as a figurehead president, while real power lay with the Socialist Unity Party and ultimately with Moscow. The contrast between the two Germanys could hardly have been starker, and it grew more pronounced with each passing year. The Federal Republic in the West was a parliamentary democracy with a market economy, integrated into the Western Alliance through North Atlantic Treaty Organization, membership in 1955, and eventually becoming a founding member of the European Economic Community in 1957, institution that would evolve into the European Union, with Germany as its central pillar. The German Democratic Republic in the East was a one-party state with a centrally planned economy, a member of the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact, and a society permeated by the surveillance apparatus of the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, the Stasi, which, at its height, employed over 90,000 full-time agents and relied on a network of nearly 200,000 civilian informants, making it, per capita, one of the most extensive secret police organizations in human history. The tension between these two Germanys and between the superpowers that stood behind them produced some of the Cold War's most dramatic crises. In June 1948, in response to the Western Allies' introduction of the Deutsche Mark, which the Soviets viewed as a provocation and a step toward a permanently divided Germany, the Soviet Union blockaded all road, rail and canal access to West Berlin, in an attempt to force the Western Allies out of the city and bring its 2 million inhabitants under Soviet control. The response was the Berlin Airlift, a staggering logistical operation in which American and British planes flew over 2 million tons of supplies into West Berlin over the course of nearly 11 months, landing at Tempelhof and Dachau airports at intervals of just a few minutes around the clock. At the height of the operation, a plane was landing in West Berlin every 30 seconds. One American pilot, Lieutenant Gale Halvorson, became beloved as the candy bomber after he began dropping small parcels of chocolate and gum attached to handmade parachutes to the children of Berlin, a gesture of humanity that became one of the enduring symbols of the airlift. The blockade failed, lifted in May 1949, but the division hardened into permanence. Then, on the night of August 12th to 13th, 1961, East German authorities began erecting what would become the Berlin Wall, a barrier that began as coils of barbed wire and makeshift fences, but quickly evolved into a heavily fortified concrete structure, complete with guard towers, anti-vehicle trenches, a raked death strip patrolled by armed soldiers with shoot-to-kill orders, and tripwire-activated automatic weapons. The wall sliced through the heart of the city, separating families, friends, and neighbors overnight. Over the 28 years of its existence, at least 140 people were killed attempting to cross it, though the true number may be higher. The wall became the most potent physical symbol of the Iron Curtain, a stark reminder that the war's aftermath had not brought unity, but had instead cleaved an entire nation and an entire continent in two. When President John F. Kennedy visited West Berlin on June 26, 1963, and declared before a crowd of hundreds of thousands, "Ich bin ein Berliner," he was articulating a truth that the whole world understood, that Berlin had become the place where the great ideological struggle of the 20th century was made visible in concrete and fiveling in vices. Steel, and that the story of post-war Germany was far from over. November 20th, 1945. In a shattered Germany, inside a courtroom in the city of Nuremberg, history itself took the witness stand. The war was over. Adolf Hitler was dead. Berlin lay in ruins. But the question lingered: how do you judge a regime responsible for unimaginable crimes? Before an international tribunal, leading Nazis, including Hermann Göring, sat behind glass, headphones pressed to their ears as translators pioneered a new system of simultaneous interpretation. For the first time, crimes against humanity entered the legal vocabulary of the world. Outside the courtroom, post-war Germany struggled to survive. Cities were rubble. Millions were displaced. Hunger and uncertainty shaped daily life as Allied powers divided the country into occupation zones, planting the early seeds of the Cold War. The Nuremberg trials were not just about punishment. They were about precedent, about drawing a line between obedience and responsibility. Tonight, we explore how justice was pursued and how a broken nation began rebuilding from the ashes.